Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Choose Inclusion for our Black Voices Matter series. I am joined by my co-hosts as usual, Mike and Yubi. How are you guys doing?
Doing great, Nina. Excited for this conversation today. Ubaldo?
Yeah, hello everybody. Good to be back.
So yeah, we're excited for our conversation today. We're talking today with Wilton Jackson. He's a reporter, used to work at the Clarion Ledger and is a professor of journalism at Jackson State University. We're excited to talk about a lot of stuff at the intersection of journalism and sports. Wilton, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be on today.
So the first question we always ask our guests in the nature of everything that's happening in the world right now, how are you holding up?
You know what? I've learned to take one day at a time, take everything one day at a time. A lot of times I would find myself in the beginning of the pandemic, I would wake up and get straight to working. And then I had to realize, like, you know what? We don't really know how long this pandemic is going to go on, plus everything else that's going on in the world. So sometimes I have to find myself getting out of bed, and then just taking some moments for me, not to look on a cell phone or television or, a podcast or anything like that, just taking some moments for me. And one thing that my trainer, I like to work out, he always tells me, the best time that you have is the time that you have right now in this moment. So I've learned during this time that, you need to take the time to live in the moment, something that I didn't always do. And, now I've learned to, like, so many things, just because of everything that's happened this year, I've learned to say, Wilton, you might want to take some time to just savor this moment, regardless if it's good, bad, or indifferent. You'll only get this moment one time, and you need to appreciate it because you'll never get it back.
Oh, that's really good advice. I need to take that to heart. So can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into journalism? What was that story and journey like?
Yeah, so I've been into journalism. I guess you could say I grew up playing sports. I started off many years ago. Like, as a kid, my dad put me in t-ball, which was a precursor to playing some baseball. And then I grew up watching basketball and wanting to play football. I never played football organized, but I always played, like, with some of my friends when we were kids. So between those three sports and then growing a love for soccer along the way, that was pretty interesting too. But the way that I really got into journalism was, as a kid, we would get we would actually get the Clarion Ledger newspaper at the time, and my father would sit down before he got sent off to Iraq for his first tour, United States Army. Excuse me. We would go down and look at the records of different teams, whether if it was for basketball, football, baseball, you name it, we would go over it. And sometimes he would give me little quizzes and ask, like, what's this team's record? What division do they play in? Or anything like that. But even beyond that, I would also read the stories that were on the front page, on the top cover, that had nothing to do with sports. And so a lot of times as a kid, you don't necessarily understand what you're reading until, like, as you get of age and be able to, like, put some substance to what's really going on in the world. And I think as I started to get older, and he kind of transitioned in and out in different phases of my life due to the military. He went to Iraq on 2 different tours. I was able to kind of piece some things together as to what I would be reading at the time, and then just kind of seeing what was in front of me on a daily basis kind of helped me connect those dots. So being able to, wanting to stay informed and then actually seeing things play out in front of me, it was like the greatest example that I ever needed to just kind of, wonder, like, okay, this is the world I'm living in. Where do I fit in as a citizen in society? Like, often I would hear my parents say, tax dollars that, citizens have to pay to do X, Y, Z and 1, 2, 3. And it's like, as a kid, when you're 8, 9, 10, even 15 or 16, you wonder, like, what does this really mean? But as you get older and you start seeing how certain laws are being made that affect you at certain age levels, whether, can you get scholarships or, financial aid for school, or, what does this look like in terms of voting or anything like that? Like, all that began to make sense to me. And so my eagerness to want to know what was going on in the world around me, that kind of really got me into journalism.
I love that, Wilton. Thank you so much again for being on. I'm super. Our pre-call, you talked a lot about, your journalism style. It's more than just a typical sports column writer, because you really focused on the journey of the athlete getting to their pinnacle. Like, it's one thing to hit 3 home runs in a game, but you really focus on their journey getting there, which really intrigued me. Can you talk more about that style of writing?
Yes, so it's interesting that when I was in college, I started my own sports blog. It's called the Red Diamond Report, which now I have a podcast that stemmed from that. But from that blog, I had this grand idea when I was in college. I started my blog, and I wanted to do stories that went beyond just like figuring out what these athletes do on the field. Like, I know in football, they're going to get, some players are going to get a certain amount of touchdowns, or in basketball, they're going to score amount of points, or in baseball, they're going to get a number of home runs. But honestly, it wasn't until I was actually interning at ESPN after I graduated from undergrad that I really put emphasis into this particular blog. And so what fascinated me was that, I grew up watching the Hannah Storms and Stuart Scotts on ESPN, and dreaming of maybe one day working at a place like Sports Illustrated and all the other major sports networks. But one thing that I really noticed about them was that their stories weren't just your typical normal stories. Like, they went behind the scenes. And I said, well, you know what, as a young 23, 24-year old kid, I'm thinking to myself, how do I set myself up to maybe get there one day? May not get there, but how do I set myself up to potentially get there? So I was like, well, you have to start somewhere. You have to start being able to tell stories that go beyond just what's going on the field. And to be honest, as I started peeling back the layers and as I got into grad school, I started to understand why these certain platforms started to tell these stories more. Because at the end of the day, anybody can go to ESPN.com and any really major sports blog platform and get a box score and stats and anything like that. Because, I mean, that's general information that most people, the general athlete or fan, wants to know. But it's nothing like being able to understand and really comprehend what some of these athletes have went through. Because believe it or not, having interviewed quite a few, they've went through a lot. And it's not just your typical stories of, I was in a single parent home, or I grew up without parents, both my parents died, or something like that. They have major stories, some that pretty much come off the heels of like, they had to be brave for themselves. Not only maybe they were by themselves, but they were determined not to quit. And to be honest, some of them, they're on the way out of their situations, not even necessarily growing up in maybe a negative situation or negative neighborhood. It's just the fact that no one was there in their life to push them in other areas of their life. And these particular sports, whether it was baseball, basketball, football, soccer, track and field, was their only way out. And so when me and my dad often talk now, and he'll say it's a difference between the kid who has only one way out versus the kid who's been groomed and somebody's been telling him before he got to high school or college that you're going to college, and you're gonna pick and choose where you want to go, but you're not gonna sit out. And granted, in the same token, school is not for everybody, but at the same time, from as a child, my dad always told me that you were gonna do these things. So I say all that to say this: knowing these athletes' stories is far more important than what they're actually doing on their specific venues in their particular sports.
Was there like one particular story that really impacted you or stood out above all the others?
I don't necessarily think I have a distinct story, because I've read so many stories. But one particular athlete that I feel that I always liked reading about, and who was my favorite athlete growing up as a kid, was Allen Iverson. And everybody knows that, Allen Iverson wasn't the best kid growing up. He stayed in a lot of trouble. And it's interesting the fact that, as his career went on, and even after he retired, that you get a chance to see a different side of him. Like, granted, on the court, everybody knew him as the answer, or he was quick, or he had this crossover. He was a fighter. Or into what some NBA players would say, he was a dog. But outside of the court, he had mentors that changed his life. Former Georgetown coach who John Thompson, who passed away this year, major mentor for him. Even Larry Brown, his coach when he was playing with the 76ers. And it's just like knowing that, where he came from to where he would eventually go through his time throughout the league. And now, I mean, it was always fascinating to me. I think that particular story, or just him as an athlete, kind of triggered me to want to be able to kind of go behind the scenes and tell some of these stories that don't necessarily always get told.
And I think what's so important about that, your approach, is, especially right now, like it's sort of been highlighted with these discussions of racism and white supremacy, where, these NBA players and these NFL players who are using their celebrity now to try to help bring about change. But you have this part of the population who frankly are like, we don't care about your story, we don't care about your stance, just play the game for me.
Right.
I mean, how have you sort of dealt with that in the last few months?
As a reporter, well, outside of a reporter, from a reporter standpoint at this point right now, I think that, what, athletes, they have a lot of power in what they can do. And I think that they took a major, specifically NBA players took a major stand. I don't think anybody expected them to not play any games based off everything that took place with the George Floyd situation. Like, when that happened, it was almost like, granted, people, a good majority of people were probably thinking like, okay, this is very different. We've never truly seen anything like this to this magnitude before. Because at the end of the day, for somebody outside of, looking at how this affects a certain group of people, or a certain group of people are getting marginalized in society, they're looking at it from a standpoint of, well, these big, companies and corporations, the NBA, the NFL, or MLB, they're all about the dollars and cents. But to see that a organization of that magnitude was able to come together, not just about, games, or especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, they decided to come together and say, you know what, this is bigger than basketball. And in most cases it is, because at the end of the day, when you're on that court with, you're playing with your players, you're getting players from all walks of life. You're not just getting Black people, you're not just getting white people, you're getting Canadians, you're getting all different types of people. But the common thread is we're all still people at the end of the day. And, there has to be a certain level of respect, regardless if it's Black, white, Canadian, or Asian, or Japanese, Chinese, whatever. Like, there's a certain level of respect that everybody deserves, as a citizen, or as a living person in this world. So to see them, come together, the athletes, I think it was a good thing. I think they sent a message that, that they are, are trying to work together for the greater good of society, specifically the NBA and also the WNBA. I mean, they had the WNBA, I feel like, honestly, was probably the leader when it comes to social justice and, pushing for that change. I would say WNBA, then NBA, and then of course, with the NFL, they've had, Breonna Taylor on the back of the helmets and things like that. But again, a lot of that also goes to, some of these commissioners and presidents of these organizations as well, where their allegiance lies per se. So a lot of it is that, do I think the athletes have a pivotal role in this? Yes. Do I think that they will do more as things sadly continue to happen? I think they will. I think that, as they continue to find ways to impact the community, and not just, going out and, having shirts, or, having these messages on the back of their jerseys, but getting involved in the communities, because that's where these things really start. Like, are you getting involved in the communities where these marginalized people, where these situations are happening? You don't really know unless you're actively trying to get there. And I feel like the more that these organizations and teams within these organizations get involved in their communities, that's where the real change is going to happen.
I had no idea that the WNBA was, doing this before everyone else. And of course, Black women were leading the way. Of course, Black women were like at the forefront and doing this before everyone else. I'm not surprised by that either. What has and yet, like, I haven't heard about the role that they've played in it. What was the WNBA doing around this?
In previous, like, not this past season, but last year, I know they would always have messages. I guess before the George Floyd situation, they always would have like certain things that were happening. If certain things were happening, they would have like messages on their shirts, standing for justice or standing for equality well before George Floyd even took place. And so to see that the NBA kind of came along with them after the George Floyd, and then also with Breonna Taylor and others that have, other situations that have happened this year, it spoke volumes on the NBA, because I think the general consensus would argue, I don't think anybody thought the NBA was going to do that. But then as players started to individually voice themselves, voice their opinions on the situation, I think it kind of forced the commissioner and everybody as a league to come together as one, and try to really, make the situation better, or, create change that, people want to see in society.
Well, and I think that you just brought up a really good point about everybody coming together. I think that's one of the key things that's sort of been a beacon of hope for me, is that, and Nina, you brought this up talking about Colin Kaepernick, that, when he first took a knee, there was no support, right? No organizational support from owners and leadership of the NFL. Fast forward to now, and total reversal in most respects. I think that's fascinating. Like, that to me is a sign of we're moving in the right direction.
Right, absolutely right. And I think that, I think looking back at it now from 2016, when Colin Kaepernick first did that, to everything that's going on in the world now with and with the really pivotal decisions that have been made towards George Floyd, and in cases like Breonna Taylor, I think it's that, people are starting to really open their eyes and maybe understand why Colin Kaepernick did what he did. And that's why now you see an overflow of, you're in an NBA bubble with 30 or more teams, having messages on their jerseys or on their shoes or anything like that, giving a sense of hope and, wanting to have an equal society, or sending that message that they want to have an equal society. And I think, believe it or not, I think it's going to continue to happen. I think that, this is something that's not going to be, definitely not a sprint, it's a marathon. And as long as, believe it or not, these things keep happening in these neighborhoods where these people are marginalized, are not getting equality on the things that are happening to them, it's going to be up to athletes. And even more than the athletes, I think the athletes are the catalyst, but I think the communities where these people live in are going to, it's some, like the local leaders and the people in those communities are going to have to stand up for themselves and really, fight for what they feel like is definitely a sense of equality.
I want to pivot back to the journalism conversation a little bit. Given the crazy news cycle that we're in, with the nature of how the world works today, with social media, with everything, what role does journalism play when it comes to addressing all of these social inequities?
Journalism plays a huge role, because my thing is, it's so much information that you see on social media. Sometimes you question, like, is this real? Is this fake? Is this fake news? Are all these things real? Like, journalists today, like, I'll say this: a journalist's job is already hard. It's always been one that's difficult, it's challenging, it's tedious, but it's needed. It was needed then, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and it's needed now more than ever, just because of the way that messages can be disseminated. Back then, 40, 50, 60 years ago, you only had television, radio, and the newspaper. Now you have newspaper, television, radio, podcasts, stories that can be made, via Instagram or all these social media apps. And like, the internet has changed everything. So as a journalist, not only are you competing with your counterparts in mainstream journalism, from the mainstream reporters at, newspapers, radio stations, and television stations, you're competing against something what would be considered as citizen journalism, meaning that, these citizens that are going out, recording these videos of incidents that are happening, whether it's like one that deals with racial injustice, or whether it's just even, as simple as something as recording a basketball game or football game. We didn't always have this level of technology that we have now, but because we do, as a full-time journalist in today's society, you have to be able to navigate all platforms. You have to be able to evaluate, is this story, is this real? Is this video, is it real? Like, does this fit? Like, you have to be able to do those things. And it's complicated. It's hard. Like, you just when you think you may be done with the story, something else may come out, and you're relying on yourself, and your news director or your editors are looking at you as the journalist saying, like, okay, if you're assigned to this beat, whether if it's sports or climate or law or anything like that, they're looking to you to find out the latest information. Sometimes the latest information may not come from a mainstream reporter. So I say all that to say this: you have to be active on everything. You have to keep your eyes and ears open, not just from people that live in these communities or city leaders or anything like that. You never know where some of your information may come from, and being able to validate and evaluate information in social media is very important now more than ever, because it's just so much information so much information that's being disseminated amongst the masses today.
I want to switch gears just a little bit with you regarding again, a perception that I had, and I know where I'm going with this, because you're from Jackson, Mississippi, and my perception growing up in the Midwest and then the rest of my adult life here in Colorado was kind of the perception of Mississippi as a whole, from purely a pretty racist kind of environment. But that's my perception. Can you either validate or debunk that myth for me?
Yes. So basically, like I said, I want in my 27 years of life, I would never say that there aren't still places in this state that are racist. I wouldn't say that, there are certain things that aren't still racist like within the state, because that would be a lie. But from a very general yet broad standpoint, the state as a whole being racist, that's not true. I do think that, is it questionable that we have certain city and state leaders that are in these positions running these particular cities and towns that may have some racist ways? Yes, to a degree. But as far as like the people themselves, like in 1 out of 10 people that you may see on a daily, I don't think someone is gonna come up to you and say some type of racist remark to you. Now, that's not to say that it won't happen, because it can still happen, because this is still Mississippi. However, it's not the Mississippi that most people still think of as it was back in the 50s, 60s, even 70s. So, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, that's what most people's perception of Mississippi is, because they hadn't been here, or they hadn't walked, or looked around to see what Mississippi has to offer. Like, they've maybe only been to certain small towns in Mississippi versus, like, coming to some of the bigger cities, like, a Jackson, or Hattiesburg, or Gulfport, or Meridian, places like that. Like, granted, is the state to a degree, lacking in certain areas? It is as well, but every state is lacking in something. But as far as like to just truly say that Mississippi is a racist state, I wouldn't say that. I think it takes for people to come and realize what's going on in Mississippi. Look at the way that businesses are trying to come, they're trying to make a better effort for businesses to come to Mississippi. And then also, granted, I don't know if you guys have paid attention, but things are somewhat changing, or I think are going to be changing for the better, specifically in Jackson. And the reason I say this is due to the fact that an HBCU, Jackson State, just named Deion Sanders as their head coach. And believe it or not, most people probably wouldn't think a head coach of his magnitude coming to the capital city of Mississippi would change things. But believe it or not, when you have big businesses from out of states looking at what he can do uh, as a platform for how he puts himself out there, that changes a lot of things. You don't know what types of businesses will come to the city of Jackson, or really in other cities across the state. How does that change for people wanting to come to certain schools in Mississippi? Will they come to Mississippi? Will they come to Jackson State? Will they come to HBCUs? Like, that changes the whole entire narrative of things. And so, like I said,
I
I,
love that.
I wouldn't necessarily say the state of Mississippi. I would not say that it's racist.
I love. I'm sorry to I did not heard the news on Deion Sanders. I absolutely do believe that individuals like that can bring a true progressive movement.
Right. No, he is. And I think that, if given time, like, granted, it's one thing for him to be the football coach on the field. But aside from the field, one thing that he mentioned when he was first unveiled to the university was that, he wanted to increase enrollment. He wanted to make sure not only these players are they playing their best on the field, but they're getting their education. Sometimes what's a huge, believe it or not, what can be looked at as a huge stigma for students in HBCU, specifically HBCU athletes. So if he does truly fulfill that purpose, this could, granted, this will be his first season coming up in the spring because HBCU football, particularly the SWAC, won't play until the spring due to the fact that they decided not to play in the fall due to COVID. But if he's able to do that and put those plans and trends in place, this is a game changer, not only for, Jackson, but the state of Mississippi, period. And that's just from a football and academic standpoint, but from a business standpoint, well, once these players, if they don't go to the next level, whatever, they're looking for jobs. Okay, they're prepared. Sometimes in certain programs, they don't get these opportunities to be they don't get the same opportunities that some other students at other schools would get in terms of being prepared for life. Granted, every athlete is not going to make a professional team, or everybody's not going to get to that top tier job in their respective fields. But if you have somebody being able to guide you, or somebody of his magnitude that can really change some things, I mean, that just does wonders, not only for the city, but the state itself.
Yeah, that's really exciting. For a minute there, I thought we got like a scoop that nobody had heard about yet, but it's already been announced. So anyway, that's really cool. Cool news. And I love the perspective, Wilton. And really, honestly, like this, we talked a lot about a lot of things, sports and journalism, and their roles and everything that's going on. And I love sort of the nuance and the layers that you brought to those conversations, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to fill in the gaps of information, so that people are just educated, right? Because it's the sustained change doesn't come without knowing the full facts around everything. So I can't thank you enough, Wilton. It's been great just to listen to you and your experience and the work you've been doing. And yeah, we really are thankful, and thanks for trusting us, with your voice.
It's no problem. I'm glad that you guys had me on.
Thanks, Wilton. Thanks, Ubaldo. Thanks, Nina.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And, continue to listen, please. ChooseInclusion.com. And there's links to all of our different platforms that we're on, but we're going to continue bringing Black voices to you, to our audience, to listen, to learn, so that we can, keep changing together. And don't forget to vote. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.